When Martha Collins walked into that courtroom wearing the same faded blue cardigan she'd worn for parent conferences every fall, a few people actually laughed, not loudly, just enough to make sure she heard it. The attorney representing the Westbrook Unified School District leaned back in his chair with the kind of smile that only comes from someone who thinks the ending has already been written. He clicked his expensive silver pen against the table and whispered something that made one of the administrators grin. In the back row, a couple of parents exchanged confused looks. One of them muttered, "Isn't that Mrs. Collins? Why doesn't she have a lawyer?" For just a second, Martha lowered her eyes toward the worn folder in her hands. 27 years of lesson plans, handwritten notes, report cards, thank you letters, and memories somehow reduced to one old accordion file held together with a rubber band. It would have been easy to mistake her silence for fear. That's exactly what everyone in that room did. What nobody realized was that quiet people usually spend a long time collecting the truth before they decide to speak. Martha was 51 years old, and if you had asked anyone in Cedar Ridge what kind of teacher she was before all this happened, you would have heard the same answer over and over. Reliable. She wasn't the teacher who won flashy state awards or appeared in newspaper articles. She wasn't the one posting classroom videos online or chasing recognition. She was simply the teacher who showed up before sunrise every morning with a travel mug full of coffee, unlocked room 214, turned on the reading lamp by the classroom library, and somehow remembered every student's birthday without writing any of them down. Kids who struggled somehow found their way into her room during lunch. Parents going through divorces trusted her with secrets their own children couldn't say out loud. Custodians joked that if they locked the building early, Martha would probably still find a way to finish grading essays in the hallway. She spent hundreds of dollars every semester buying novels because the school budget never seemed to cover enough books. Every Christmas, she'd quietly leave grocery gift cards inside holiday cards for families she knew were having a rough year, never signing her name. She believed teaching wasn't about raising test scores. It was about convincing a 12-year-old that one bad chapter didn't mean the whole story was over. Then came the spring that changed everything. The district had invested millions into a new testing initiative, promising higher scores would attract grants, better rankings, and more funding. When the results came back, they were disappointing. Not catastrophic, not the worst in the state, just lower than the superintendent had confidently predicted during board meetings. Reporters started asking questions. Parents demanded explanations. School board members suddenly needed someone to blame before election season rolled around. They didn't investigate curriculum changes. They didn't examine staffing shortages. They ignored overcrowded classrooms and budget cuts. Instead, they searched for someone who looked replaceable. Martha happened to be the oldest English teacher in the middle school. She was only 2 years away from qualifying for her full retirement package. Replacing her with a younger teacher would save the district a significant amount of money. Funny how financial convenience sometimes disguises itself as accountability. One Tuesday afternoon, right after her last class finished discussing To Kill a Mockingbird, the principal asked her to step into the office. Martha assumed they were planning next semester's reading list. Instead, Human Resources was already waiting. An envelope sat on the table. No conversation. No warning. No performance improvement plan. Just a prepared statement claiming she had failed to adequately prepare students for academic success. Her employment was terminated immediately. Her retirement benefits were frozen pending review. She was instructed to collect her belongings before students returned the following morning. Martha remembered staring at the paper longer than she remembered reading it. She kept expecting someone to say it was a mistake. Nobody did. When she walked back into room 214, the afternoon sunlight was still shining across the desks exactly the way it had every spring for nearly 3 decades. She packed her books into cardboard boxes while trying not to cry over something as simple as a coffee mug one of her former students had painted for Teacher Appreciation Week 15 years earlier. As she reached the parking lot carrying the final box, she heard someone yelling behind her. "Mrs. Collins." It was Emma, one of her 7th graders, running across the sidewalk holding a notebook. Before the girl could reach her, the assistant principal stepped between them. Students are not permitted to contact former staff on school grounds. Martha watched the little girl's smile disappear into confusion. She wanted to explain, wanted to tell her none of this was Emma's fault, but the words never came. She simply smiled, waved one last time, and drove home wondering how 27 years could end in less than 27 minutes. The hardest part wasn't losing the paycheck. It wasn't even losing the retirement she'd spent decades earning. It was waking up every weekday morning at 5:30 because her body still believed children were waiting for her, only to remember there was nowhere left to go. For months, she stayed quiet. Friends urged her to move on. Her sister wanted her to retire early. Even neighbors said fighting the district would only make things worse. Maybe they were right. Until one afternoon, a former colleague quietly slipped an envelope into Martha's mailbox with no return address. Inside were copies of internal emails the district never expected her to see. And after reading the very first page, Martha realized she hadn't been fired because she had failed her students. She had been sacrificed because someone else had failed the system. And that was the moment she decided she was done staying silent. Margaret turned the envelope over 3 times before opening it. There wasn't a name on the front, no return address, no handwritten note explaining who had sent it. Just a plain white business envelope that looked like every other piece of mail she'd ever received. She slid a finger beneath the flap and unfolded several printed emails, a budget summary, and a single yellow sticky note with 6 words written in black marker. They lied. Start with March 14th. That was it. No signature. No explanation. Margaret carried everything to the kitchen table, made herself a fresh cup of coffee, and began reading. Within 10 minutes, she stopped breathing long enough to realize she was gripping the edge of the table. The first email wasn't about her at all. It was an exchange between district administrators discussing budget reductions several months before the standardized tests. Reading specialists had been reassigned. Classroom aides were eliminated. After-school literacy funding had been quietly cut in half. One principal warned that struggling readers would almost certainly fall behind if those programs disappeared. Another administrator replied that the reductions were temporary and public discussion should be avoided until after testing season. Margaret leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She remembered those meetings. She remembered asking why her reading intervention groups suddenly doubled in size. She remembered being told they needed to be creative with existing resources. She also remembered volunteering 3 afternoons every week because there simply weren't enough adults to help the children who needed it most. Suddenly, every confusing decision from the previous school year started fitting together like pieces of a puzzle she never realized she was solving. The next morning, she drove to the public library instead of the school she no longer worked at. For the first time in nearly 30 years, she wasn't preparing lesson plans. She was preparing a case. Every day she arrived when the doors opened, spreading documents across one of the quiet study tables while retirees read newspapers nearby and college students worked on laptops. At first, she wasn't even sure what she was looking for. She simply followed dates, compared emails, highlighted names, and built a timeline. 3 days later, another surprise arrived. Helen Foster, a retired school counselor who had worked beside Margaret for almost 20 years, quietly walked into the library carrying a weathered storage box. She placed it on the table without saying much. "I've been cleaning out my garage," she said with a small smile. "I thought these belonged with someone who still believes the truth matters." Inside were copies of annual teacher evaluations that Helen had legally retained after retirement, newsletters celebrating literacy achievements, and dozens of internal reports documenting student growth. Margaret carefully flipped through them until she found her own personnel evaluations. Every single one praised her classroom management, instructional quality, and measurable student improvement. One evaluation, signed by the very principal who sat silently during her termination meeting, described her as one of the strongest instructional leaders in the district and a mentor to younger faculty. Margaret couldn't help laughing, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Apparently, I became incompetent somewhere between February and April," she said. Helen shook her head. "No, you became expensive." That sentence stayed with Margaret for days. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't emotional. It was simply honest. Margaret was only 18 months away from qualifying for the district's highest retirement tier. Replacing her with a first- or second-year teacher would save hundreds of thousands of dollars over time. She didn't want to believe money had anything to do with it, until another former colleague called from a private number one evening. "Don't mention my name," he said immediately. "They're trying to figure out who's been talking." Margaret recognized his voice but respected his request. "I won't." He sighed. The board wanted someone held responsible before the annual community meeting. They knew the budget cuts contributed to the scores, but admitting that would have raised questions about district leadership. They wanted a visible example of accountability. Margaret stared silently through her kitchen window. So they picked me. You were close to retirement, respected by parents, and quiet enough that they assumed you'd walk away. She thanked him before hanging up, then sat alone in the dark for nearly an hour. The anger she expected never really came. What replaced it was disappointment. She had always told her students that adults should take responsibility for their mistakes. Now she realized some adults taught the opposite lesson. Friends encouraged her to move on. Her younger sister even suggested early retirement. You don't need this stress, she insisted. Let them have their victory. Margaret smiled gently. That's exactly why I can't. She wasn't fighting because she missed grading essays or attending faculty meetings. She was fighting because somewhere in Maple Creek there were children watching adults decide whether honesty actually mattered. If she accepted being called a failure when the evidence clearly said otherwise, what lesson would that teach the next generation? So she kept working. Every document received a colored tab. Every email was organized by date. Every evaluation was placed beside the district's public statements. She created a timeline stretching nearly 6 feet across her dining room wall using string, sticky notes, and index cards. Looking at it from across the room, one thing became painfully obvious. The district's story changed almost every month. The facts never did. About 6 weeks before trial, Margaret found what would become the most important document of all. Buried inside hundreds of archived emails was a message from Superintendent Richard Lawson himself. It had been sent just 5 months before her dismissal. Margaret, it began, thank you for your extraordinary commitment to student literacy. Your willingness to volunteer additional instructional hours has made a measurable difference for our most vulnerable learners. Maple Creek is fortunate to have educators like you. She read it once, then again, then laughed softly to herself. Well, Richard, she whispered, one of us isn't telling the same story anymore. The morning of the hearing arrived faster than she expected. She couldn't afford an attorney, despite speaking with several who admitted she appeared to have a strong case. The retainers alone were more than she had left after months without a paycheck. So she ironed her favorite cardigan, packed every document into the old accordion folder she'd carried to parent conferences for years, and drove to the courthouse before sunrise. She wasn't fearless. Her hands trembled while she parked the car. She sat behind the steering wheel for several minutes, reminding herself to breathe. Then she remembered something she'd once told a frightened 7th grader before a class presentation. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means fear doesn't get to make the decision. She smiled. Apparently, she still had good advice. When she stepped inside the courtroom, the district's legal team had already filled one entire table. 2 attorneys, the superintendent, 3 administrators, human resources, even a communications consultant. Margaret placed her worn folder on the opposite table and quietly took her seat alone. One attorney glanced toward her and smirked. This won't take long, he whispered confidently to the superintendent. Margaret pretended not to hear him. She had spent almost 3 decades teaching 12-year-olds. She knew overconfidence when she saw it. A few moments later, Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered the courtroom. She greeted both parties, reviewed the docket, then looked directly at Margaret. Mrs. Harper, she said calmly, I understand you're representing yourself today. Margaret nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The judge offered a small, respectful smile. Very well. The court is ready to hear the truth, wherever it leads. Margaret took one slow breath, rested her hand on the old accordion folder, and realized the people who laughed when she walked through the courtroom doors had absolutely no idea what was sitting inside it. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Judge Eleanor Whitmore looked down at the final exhibit resting on her bench, then slowly removed her glasses. Mr. Lawson, she said, her voice calm enough to make the silence feel even heavier. This court has reviewed your district's performance evaluations, your internal budget discussions, your public statements, and your private emails. One version praises Mrs. Harper as an exceptional educator whose dedication changed children's lives. The other claims she suddenly became unfit to teach only a few months later. Those 2 stories cannot both be true. Superintendent Richard Lawson shifted uneasily in his chair. Your Honor, leadership sometimes requires difficult decisions. The judge nodded slightly. It certainly does. But leadership also requires honesty, and I have seen very little of that today. She turned another page before continuing. The evidence shows that literacy programs were reduced despite repeated warnings from educators. Staffing shortages were ignored. Student support services were cut. When the expected test scores failed to materialize, the district looked for a public example instead of accepting responsibility for its own decisions. Mrs. Harper was not dismissed because she failed her students. She was dismissed because someone believed sacrificing one respected teacher would protect everyone else sitting at this table. You could almost feel the air leave the room. The attorney who had mocked Margaret earlier no longer looked confident. He quietly closed his notebook, knowing there was nothing left to argue. Judge Whitmore straightened the papers in front of her. This court therefore finds in favor of the plaintiff. Margaret Harper is to receive full back pay, immediate restoration of all retirement benefits, compensation for reputational damages, and the option to return to her teaching position without prejudice. A wave of quiet gasps rolled through the gallery. One parent covered her mouth. Another teacher sitting in the back wiped away tears. Margaret stood perfectly still, almost afraid to believe she had heard the words correctly. Then the judge looked directly at the district administrators one final time. I have one additional order. Every administrator directly involved in this decision will spend 2 full weeks working inside active middle school classrooms under the supervision of veteran teachers. You will help struggling readers, supervise lunch duty, meet with parents, grade assignments, and remain until the last student leaves each afternoon. Perhaps then you will remember that education is built on people, not statistics. The gavel struck once. Court is adjourned. The room immediately came alive. Reporters rushed toward the hallway. Camera shutters clicked nonstop. Parents surrounded Margaret, thanking her for refusing to give up. Several younger teachers quietly shook her hand, admitting they had been afraid to speak because they worried they would become the next target. Margaret thanked them with the same gentle smile she'd worn in classrooms for nearly 3 decades. She wasn't interested in celebrating someone else's embarrassment. She had only wanted the truth to be heard. As she stepped into the courthouse lobby, a familiar voice stopped her. Mrs. Harper? She turned to see a young man wearing a college graduation gown, holding a small gift bag in one hand. For a moment she searched his face, then her eyes lit up. Ethan Morales? He laughed. I can't believe you still remember me. Margaret smiled through tears. Teachers remember more than people think. Ethan reached into the bag and carefully pulled out an old paperback copy of The Outsiders. The cover was faded, the pages worn from years of use. Inside the front cover was a note written in blue ink. Never let one difficult chapter convince you your story is over. Keep reading. Keep believing. Mrs. Harper, you gave me this in 7th grade, Ethan said quietly. Back then I could barely read aloud without freezing. Every afternoon you stayed after school until I finally believed I wasn't stupid. Last week I graduated from college, and this fall I'll be teaching 4th grade. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. Ethan smiled. Everything happening in that courtroom today mattered, but honestly, none of it is the reason people will remember you. They'll remember you because you changed lives when nobody was watching. Margaret looked down at the old book in her hands and realized he was right. Court victories eventually become old newspaper articles. Awards collect dust. Job titles disappear. But kindness has a strange way of living on inside people long after the moment itself has passed. As she walked down the courthouse steps into the warm afternoon sun, she felt lighter than she had in months. She hadn't won because she defeated the district. She had won because the truth finally stood where everyone could see it. And maybe that's the kind of lesson every school should teach first. Before you go, I'd really like to hear what you think. Did the judge make the right decision? Or should the administrators have faced even harsher consequences for using one teacher as a scapegoat? Have you ever had a teacher who changed your life in a way they probably never knew? Share your story in the comments, because those are the people who deserve to be remembered. And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes one good teacher can change the course of a life.